Dale with Gospel Billboards.
Hi, Dale.
Yes, glad to talk with you today.
My name's Ryan. How are you doing?
Yes, doing well, Ryan.
Wonderful. Well, I was driving on a long drive today, and I saw one of your billboards, 83 for Truth, and it was talking about, what is truth and call this number, right? And so, I've had some experience with the Bible. I mean, years ago I read through it. I grew up in a pretty non-committal household. It wasn't a very religious household. But, when I see a billboard that very much highlights the conversation of truth, I think that's very important. And I was like, you know what? That's probably a worthwhile number to call. Because for me, one of the most important maybe subcategories of truth is what we could maybe call moral truth, right? And one of my issues with, the Bible, and I'd say other religious books like the Quran, is that morality is not something that is, discovered and argued for, examined. It's something that's dictated. It's thou shalt not, and it's just left at that. It's not connected to, say, a moral project, a larger moral project of like human flourishing, like in the Aristotelian tradition, Aristotle and all them. And so when let's just take one example, because I think we could look at a lot of issues, but let's just take one example. Homosexuality. If we look at my perspective on it, I examine, morality based on, human flourishing, which is a large project. So someone says to me, Ryan, shooting up heroin, I think that's the moral and right thing to do. I would say, well, you can assert that, but let's examine the effects here. If you shoot up heroin, you're going to destroy your body. You're going to destroy your relationships with others. You're going to, cloud your judgment, and that can put both yourself and others at risk. All kinds of bad things, and it destroys your overall person. And so I would say, on those outcomes, that doesn't go with the moral project of human flourishing at all. And so it wouldn't make sense. If I look at homosexuality, I go, okay, you're attracted to someone of the same sex. You've had a relationship with them. You've built a life together. You live together who knows how long. Seems perfectly fine to me. You're not harming yourself in the process. You're not harming other people. So no problem there. But if we go on the biblical perspective, it goes, well, a man shall never lie with another man as he does a woman. It's an abomination. And that's the end of the story. There's no argument. There's nothing. It's just thou shalt not, and we drop the mic. And for me, that type of morality doesn't go for me. It's just divine command theory. The Muslims and the Quran have the same thing, even though they have different perspectives. So I guess I love your focus on your billboard with truth, but I think at the end of the day, especially if we're talking about moral truth, it doesn't quite do it for me.
Okay. So what would be your goal?
Yeah. Well, no,
today?
I mean, I figured, calling you up, like maybe I've got a blind spot I don't see, that's perfectly possible. I'm a young man, all things considered. And I don't know everything, and like I said, I've read the Bible, but I can't say to have read it as many times as other people. But, I think it's just, especially since the billboard very much focused on truth. And I think we live in a society today that seems very post-truth. Like people go, well, what's good for you may not be good for me, and that's okay. Or they'll say something like, it's true for me, but it's not truth for you. You may have heard that, right? And I think that's just weak sauce garbage, where someone doesn't want to have to argue for what their views are. They get to just say, well, that's just true for me. I can't stand that, because it's like, it's not someone's opinion whether or not the moon is up there, right? It's not someone's opinion whether the earth is flat versus whether it's, a sphere of a sorts, right? It's either objectively true or it's not. And I think you and I probably would both agree with that. And so, I think when I see a billboard that's very much focusing on that, I get kind of excited. Like I want to call up and be like, hey, maybe they can show me where I've kind of led astray. And who knows why I was so pulled to call the number, because I rarely ever call numbers, but it just seemed important to do.
Well, great. I'm so glad that you did. So, if we're looking at human flourishing, you believe that homosexuality is going to impact our society in any way?
Sure, I think anything will impact our society.
How might that be for homosexuality, for example?
Yeah, good question. Well, I would say that just like in animals, so for example, we've observed, at least let's say, homosexual behavior. It's hard to put identities of any kind on animals, but we've observed homosexual behavior in horses, and yet there's still a flourishing horse population, because it's not like every horse is engaging in homosexual behaviors. But there's a lot of thinking on, like, why do we see this pop up in not just humans but also other animals? And it's like, maybe this is just a hypothesis. I don't think anyone can really know, but maybe it's just that, homosexual behavior can be an advantage for a population. That if a low number of people, because it's not everybody, it's a pretty small portion of the population, if a low number of people are engaging in it, they can be, people that are caretakers of a kind. They're not putting their time and energy into raising a family, but they can spend time helping other people, right? That's one possible thought. I'm not saying that's the case, because again, you'd have to study it somehow. But we just observed that this happens in many species. I think it's like 50,000 different species have had some population that takes shape in it. And that doesn't seem like a problem if it's especially occurring so large scale. It's like, given that there's a God that created the whole world, seriously, it's propagating it in so many other species other than our own. So it seems to me that it must have some kind of advantage. Now, granted, that doesn't mean that there can be no drawbacks, just like heterosexuals can do certain behaviors that have drawbacks. But to just observe that, yes, it exists, and there are people who are good people who are homosexuals and they're having flourishing relationships, seems to me that we shouldn't do a blanket attack. That doesn't mean you do a blanket defense of everything that happens, right? Because I'm sure there's plenty of gay individuals who take part in what I would say are very harmful behaviors, right? But I could say the same for heterosexuals, for that matter. So I guess my problem here isn't, well, let's try to see if we can find good and bad and here and there. It's just that clearly this exists. It exists in a lot of different species besides our own. And it seems like it can exist in a positive form. So if I'm reading a book that says it's absolutely wrong no matter what in all times and places, that's going to jive against my, I would say, my own morality that I've been able to ascertain, and I've been able to research and study. I've read a lot of the great thinkers, Aquinas and Aristotle and so on and so forth. So yeah, whereas I think if I could predict maybe, what the perspective you might hold would be, is that, look, marriage is between one man and woman. Marriage is only for procreation. It can't have multi-purpose. Procreation is not for pleasure. It's for creating the species. And that's it. There can be no other options. And so if you want a population that's growing, if you want, strong bonds, you're probably going to defend a very recent form of the nuclear family, not rather than say the extended family, like that's the way it has to be. And I mean, from my perspective, I go, that's really great. And it is important. No one's saying it's not, but it doesn't mean that it can't coexist with these other, I think, flourishing relationships. So I'll stop there. I said a lot.
Oh, sure, you did. Yeah, that's fine. Keep going.
No, I'm sorry. No, you go ahead. Yeah.
No, it's okay, Ryan. It's all right. You have a lot on your mind.
Thank you.
A lot of sorting through what is moral and what is good and what is beneficial for our society.
Yeah.
You've drawn some conclusions, which we all have, about some of these things. Do you believe there's a God, Ryan?
I'm an agnostic. So in other words, that's to say that I'm not convinced there isn't a God, but I'm not convinced that there is. I'm open-minded to the possibility that there is a God of some kind. But it would be a jump to go from that to say any specific version, So I'm not
Sure.
I'm not hostile to it. I'm also not hostile to religion. In fact, I oftentimes will go to the liturgical churches because I get a lot of I don't even know what the right word is. I get a lot of benefit from ritual, if that makes sense. I find it very psychologically beneficial. And so I take part in churches from time to time. That may not be, in the way that I would say maybe you would take part in it, but, I take benefits from it. So I'm not hostile to religion. I'm not hostile to the idea that a God could exist. But I've examined the arguments, say, from there's the book called The Case for Christ. I've read through that. I've listened to talks by John Lennox, who's a British mathematician, and he's argued for God's existence. And I enjoy reading the arguments. There's like the cosmological argument, the argument from contingency, the moral argument, the teleological argument, also known as the argument from design. And there's some others, but those are some of the main ones. William Lane Craig talks about the Kalam cosmological argument. And I think they're all very, intelligible arguments. I don't necessarily think they achieve their goals, but they're worth taking seriously. But I've in all of my studies and the readings that I've done and listening to various figures like Alvin Plantinga and stuff, I still leave going, I'm not so convinced of the case being made. I'm just not going to throw out, an absolute statement like, a lot of the atheists do and say there is no God. I think that's a lot of hubris there. So I kind of sit back and I go, maybe there is, and that God who, if given that it's a certain God, like let's say it's an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving God, that God would know what it would take to convince me. And until such a time that it does, I can't worry too much about it because I'm doing all the readings. I'm doing all the engagements in the arguments. And so that's the best that anyone can hope to do. And you don't get to kind of decide whether you're convinced or not. You just either become convinced or you don't. But you have to do a good, honest job of taking inventory, I think, of the various arguments for and against, various perspectives, because, not all Christian perspectives are equal. I think Calvinists are probably the least palatable of the Christians. They don't seem to jive with most Christians. So that now I don't know what you believe, so I'll be careful there. But I think it's safe to say that Calvinists are not the majority of Christians. So I guess it's all to say that I think I've done a not terrible job at looking at the arguments, looking at the perspectives, and trying to do an honest assessment of it all, even if at the end of the day I've kind of come out saying, I'm not a big fan of these like new atheist types who are like very rigid and they say there's no God. But on the other hand, I haven't come all the way on the other side of saying, no, there is one, and it has these attributes and all those types of things. So sorry again for another long-winded explanation, but I think it's not easy to give a simple answer, if that makes sense.
Yes. And so the reality is that our life is taking a direction. Would you say that there is any direction affected because there could be a God?
Well, I mean, so for example, if we're both in the same world right now, I would say, I think we both would agree with that anyway. There are such a thing as solipsists who think only they exist, but that's not me. So I would say we both share space in this world. I don't know where you live, but, we're both on the same planet. And so history has come up to this point, right? History has come up to this point. And, on your account, it's come up to this point with a God existing. On my account, I've looked at it and I'm not convinced that a God did bring us to this point. But here's the problem is we both have a way of accounting for, well, here we are now. And on your account, there is a God. On my account, there isn't one. But if we were to suddenly go, oh, Ryan, you're convinced there is a God, that could certainly change shape into, let's say, my understanding of where we're headed, right? Because, either way, we're both observing where we've been. We may have a different explanation for how it all came about, but it certainly would then change my perspective in going, oh, where do I think we're headed, right? Because if on your specific view, I know not all Christians believe this way, but I'm just trying to do my best. If your view is of a very what's the word? Like a rapture-based view of Christianity, where there's going to be this very big, climactic moment that's going to come down the road. Given that I became convinced of that version suddenly, that would change my perspective on where we're headed, right? But given that my perspective was not changed, I would be more or less convinced that we're going to go on kind of the way we are. There's going to be differences that happen. God forbid we develop very powerful artificial intelligence in the next 20, 50 years, because that will be, who knows what doors that will open up, and it could be pretty bad, actually. But, I would perceive us going down more or less the track that we're on. And I think that we could destroy ourselves with various technologies, whether that's nuclear weapons or, some very powerful artificial intelligence. But I guess that's the point, is that you're asking me, if you hold the perspective that a God exists, could that change shape of how things are going to go? And I would say yes. But at this juncture, I don't see any reason for me to take on that perspective, if that makes sense.
So today, you're advocating something that is good for human flourishing.
Is that a question?
Am I hearing you right?
I'm saying that I support what I consider the moral project, and it's largely in the kind of the Aristotelian sense of human flourishing, well-being, right? And there's a lot of things that are not a part of that project, which I would say using hard drugs is not a part of that project. I don't even drink alcohol myself. I don't think that it's good to ingest these substances. But there are other things that I would say, you might not even say it's not moral or immoral. It's simply amoral. Like, there's nothing inherently right or wrong about it. It just is. The fact, like taking, for example, there are a lot of species beyond our own that engage in homosexual behaviors. It's not just humans. We're not going to put identities on them because it's hard to put identities on, but they certainly engage in homosexual behavior. And so clearly, if there is a creator, it proliferated this all over. There's like 50,000 species or something that engage in those behaviors. And so, especially with animals, we're really not going to say it's moral or not moral. But with humans, we can assess it and go, well, let's just say, is it immoral? Let's not get into the amoral versus moral distinction. Just, is it immoral? Well, I'm going to assess, is it damaging their body and necessarily? Is it harming other people necessarily? And I'm going to examine their lives. I've got a lot of friends who are gay, and I'm going to go, well, they look like they're having a pretty flourishing life, all things told. Everyone's got struggles, but I mean, they're in a relationship for 15 plus years. In some cases, they're raising kids, not all cases. And they seem to largely be having a flourishing life. And so if it was necessarily destructive, if it was necessarily, harmful, then, like the Bible says in Matthew 7:17, a good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. And if I assess these people's lives, it would suggest to me that they're certainly good trees because they're bearing good fruit. If they were necessarily bad trees, we would not see good fruit coming from their lives. Certainly not overwhelmingly good. And so, yeah, I think it seems to me that, I mean, that's one issue. I didn't mean to it's hard to have so many issues to discuss, right? But to just take that one issue, which is often pretty contentious, it seems to me that's an account where a very, very rigid conservative biblical perspective is going to say it's inherently immoral and wrong. And then my perspective of the very broad Aristotelian project of human flourishing would suggest, no, it doesn't seem immoral at all.
Yeah, well, thank you for your input there, Ryan.
Okay. Thank you for listening.
I think we talked one other time.
Did we?
Would that be possible or no?
Well, I'm not really sure, John. It's possible, but I'm not very sure. Are you on other networks or anything like that, like EWTN or anything like that?
I am not. No.
Okay, so I don't know. It's hard to say.
Yeah. Yeah, it just seems like we've discussed this before, and it's obvious that you have discussed it many other times with being read up on the case for Christ, being read up on, William Lane Craig, and so on. You have had that presentation.
Okay.
The question is, where to go with it in this conversation. A person can choose to believe something, or they can reject belief in something,
right.
Whatever it is. I can choose and say Ford is a better vehicle than a Chevy, and I can choose to believe that just based on how it looks going down the road. Well, that doesn't have any validity. You know, the validity is when I know for a fact that it's going to outlast the Chevy, if that's the case.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not for one or the other. I'm just using it as an illustration.
Of course.
And so I'm saying that people can choose to believe something. Oh, it looks like this here is going to be the best, and they don't even have an experiment to try it. They're not even willing to try it. They just say, oh, that's bad, this was good.
Right. You have to have standards. You have to have standards by which you judge things. I guess you could call it criteria, right? You know, like whether Ford or Chevy is good, it's like, well, okay, how well are they made? You know, do they withstand accidents as good? You know, do they get good gas mileage, or are they like burning a hole in your pocket, right? Like you have to have criteria by which you judge whether something is good and effective, I guess is a good question. But
that is correct.
Yeah.
That's my point.
Yeah, I agree.
Some people are choosing not to even look at those things. And
probably most people.
With, you know, why I strongly believe there is a God.
Yeah.
I have tried and found and believe somebody who has not tried and hasn't wanted, you know, has this thing of standing against God.
Yeah.
Well, they're not going to find. In the same way with the person on the other side of the fence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. No.
Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah.
Have a good day.
All right. You take care.
Goodbye.
Bye.